You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from theheart.org on Medscape.
You can now access the latest in medical news on your Amazon Alexa-enabled device. Join me, Perry Wilson, every weekday morning for Medscape Medical Minute, where I highlight the top medical stories of the day. To add Medscape Medical Minute to your flash briefing, search for Medscape Medical Minute on Amazon and click Enable. Or open the Amazon Alexa app, go to Skills, search for Medscape Medical Minute, and click Enable. Then say, Alexa, what's the news? Or, Alexa, what's my flash briefing? I hope you'll join us.
Hi everyone, this is John Mandrola from theheart.org Medscape Cardiology, and this is This Week in Cardiology for May 29th, 2020. This week, COVID, nursing homes, EBM, ventricular tachycardia and hydroxychloroquine, and remdesivir. First, a brief update on the numbers. When I recorded last week, there were 1.6 million cases in the U.S., and today there are 1.75 million. The rate of growth of 1.08x was not changed much from last week. The U.S. deaths last week were 96,000 and today 102,000. The rate of rise of deaths declined from 1.12x to 1.06x this week. That's now about 6 weeks with the rates of cases and deaths on a plateau. Again, this is looking like the new normal. The question, though, for the next month or so is whether opening up will lead to a change in the slope of the death rates. A brief note from home. We had a small surge of COVID patients in recent days here in our medium-sized city. It was easily handled by the hospitals, which are completely ready with plenty of excess capacity. The notable feature of this surge was that it was all from nursing homes. This got me looking into a bit, and I learned how hard it is for nursing facilities to protect against pathogens. First, remember, healthy people don't get admitted to the nursing home. These are older patients with multiple conditions who are often quite close to end of life. Here's a stat from the CDC. In 2016, well before the pandemic, nursing home residents made up just 0.4% of the U.S. population, but they accounted for 19% of the deaths. I also learned that more than half of residents in nursing homes need up to 4 hours of hands-on care every day for things like bladder incontinence, mobility assistance, and feeding. Another CDC nugget pre-pandemic, as many as 380,000 people die of infections in long-term care facilities every year. Dan Kahneman says it's always good to understand the base rate. Recently, I was talking with a patient who has a brother and a sister in a nursing home, and he said that both of them were locked in their rooms with no visitors. My patient said both of his siblings were of sound mind, and they were pleading to get out, even at the risk of getting coronavirus. I don't have a policy answer for the problem of COVID in nursing homes, but I do know that A, these are highly vulnerable patients that are susceptible to any insult, infectious or non-infectious. Due to their frailty, these patients need lots of human contact. And C, solitary confinement is pretty darn inhumane. So when we implement strategies to mitigate infection-related deaths in this cohort, we should be very careful about our metrics for success. A quick note on the global situation. There are now almost 6 million COVID cases with 2.5 million people recovered. Brazil continues to look scary with its rate of rise of cases and deaths. And I still don't know what to make of India with its exceedingly low death of only 3 per million. How is this country with its massively populated cities faring so well? Of course, I keep an eye on Sweden with their laxer social distancing, and I don't notice much change relative to their European comparators from last week. Second topic is on testing basics. This is a special shout out this week to Dr. Venk Murthy, who in a Twitter thread using 2x2 tables explained a huge hurdle for widespread testing of asymptomatic people in areas with low virus prevalence. I'll send a link to that tutorial. Norway published a story of how they engaged in screening asymptomatic people for the virus. You know, like what many companies and organizations are planning to do soon. They used a PCR test because of its super high specificity. Yet get this, and I'll go through these numbers slowly. Norway estimated a viral prevalence of about 1 out of 10,000 people. Norway also told us that if you test a town with about 12,000 people, one person has COVID and has a positive test, but for every true positive, you will get 12 false positives. That means the probability of having the disease, if you have a positive test, is only 7%. Now, Dr. Murthy used these numbers to fill in the 2x2 table and back-calculated that the PCR test specificity was 99.9%. So you see the problem. Even with an amazingly specific test, if you have low disease prevalence, then for every one positive, you're going to have 12 false positives. This has huge implications for businesses, professional sports, or other large organizations that think testing is an easy answer. Also, how are we going to chase down all these false positives? That's a lot of work for contact tracers, and it's a bunch of people to put on quarantine, potentially for nothing. But even if the prevalence of the virus is 10 times higher at 1 in 1,000 people, then still, for a 99.9% specific test, for every true positive, there will be one false positive, which is a positive predictive value of less than 50%. Now to a bit of COVID in cardiology. The big news this week on both fronts come from an observational study published in The Lancet looking at the use of hydroxychloroquine, chloroquine, and macrolide antibiotics, azithromycin mostly. The study reported that the drugs associated with significant harm, including ventricular tachycardia. As background, recall that HCQ and AZ use was codified into COVID protocols in some of the most respected programs in the world. This was shocking to me because of the utter weakness of the evidence for efficacy. Remember that the original study from southern France had no randomization, and the authors simply removed patients who did worse on the drug from their analysis. Basically, this was an unstudy. And since that initial unstudy, 2 small RCTs and numerous other observational studies have been published, and there's been no clear signal that these drugs benefit patients with COVID infection. Now to the Lancet paper. This was a large, multinational registry analysis of the use of hydroxychloroquine or chloroquine with or without a macrolide for the treatment of COVID-19. It came from 670 hospitals on 6 continents. There were 4 treatment groups plus a control. There was chloroquine alone, chloroquine with a macrolide, hydroxychloroquine alone, or hydroxychloroquine with a macrolide. And then patients who received none of these treatments formed the control group. Patients on vents or patients who received remdesivir were excluded. The primary endpoint was in-hospital death, or VT. There were 96,000 patients, and this was from a Surgisphere database, which takes de-identified data obtained by automated data extraction from electronic health records, supply chain databases, and financial records. About 15,000 patients were in the 4 treatment groups, and about 82,000 were in the control arm. As with all observational studies, the authors attempted to adjust for baseline differences that occur because the groups were not randomized. And the results showed huge effect sizes, basically a 33 to 45% higher rate of death and a 4 to fold higher rate of ventricular arrhythmias for patients who are taking the drugs alone or in combination. And the authors concluded that, quote, we were unable to confirm a benefit of hydroxychloroquine or chloroquine when used alone or with a macrolide on in-hospital outcomes for COVID-19. And each of these drugs regimens was associated with a decreased in-hospital survival and an increased frequency of ventricular arrhythmias when used for the treatment of COVID-19 infection. This conclusion caused mainstream media to take off with the message that these drugs were harmful. France has banned use of the drugs, and the WHO has paused some ongoing RCT trials of HCQ. But, my friends, this sort of analysis is deeply flawed. This paper and its reception make the podcast because it transcends COVID-19 to the translation of medical evidence at the bedside. Here are some comments from famous people I found on Twitter when the study was published. Professor Rod Hayward from Michigan called it non-evidence that should not have been published. Drs. David Brown and Mike Johansson said it was unreliable data because you can't adjust away differences in selection bias. Dr. Robert Ye from Beth Israel in Boston wrote that the large sample size does nothing to overcome confounding, and in fact the lack of granular data can make confounding even more likely. Dr. Robert Califf, the former FDA commissioner, said, quote, "I'm disturbed by the number of highly health literate people, including some regulators, who look at observational studies and pronounce that the evidence is already in." But these tweets were just addressing the problems of observational data. Columbia statistician Professor Andrew Gelman has been chronicling other problems with the study, including inconsistencies in death numbers from Australia, dubious data from Japan, and inconsistencies in drug dosing. Then, this morning, right before I recorded this podcast, Dr. Alan Chang, an infectious disease doctor and epidemiologist from Australia, tweeted an open letter of concern to The Lancet signed by many scientists about the inconsistencies in this study. Now note that these concerns do not necessarily imply fraud. They simply express concern that the data is inaccurate, which to me is hardly implausible because the database extracts information from electronic health records, which we know are problematic. But also, make no mistake that my critique is in no way changes my belief that hydroxychloroquine or azithromycin should have only been used in RCTs from the beginning. Critique of this paper does not bear on what you think of the drugs. My feeling was that it was wrong to codify the drugs as normal therapy with shoddy data, and now it is wrong to destroy equipoise on shoddy data. There are ongoing RCTs of these agents, and the answer will come from proper trials. Speaking of proper trials, let's talk about remdesivir. Just a couple of hours after this podcast posted last Friday, the New England Journal published preliminary results of the double-blind, placebo-controlled ACTT-1 trial of remdesivir in COVID-19 infection. I will keep it brief, but it is big news on both the viral and EBM front. My take is mostly about the EBM aspects, and the EBM aspects of this drug translates amazingly well to understanding cardiology evidence. So here goes. I see some similarities to the great MitraClip for secondary MR mystery. Remember that? A French RCT called MITRA-FR delivered utterly null results, but months later, an American study called COAP delivered stunningly positive results. It's sort of similar with remdesivir. The Lancet published an RCT performed in Hubei, China with 237 patients who had COVID-19 on May 16th. They had 2-to-1 randomization with about 158 in the remdesivir arm and about 80 in the placebo arm. The authors found that remdesivir use was not associated with the difference in time to clinical improvement. Provocatively, remdesivir did not result in significant reductions in viral RNA loads or detectability in the upper respiratory tract or sputum in the study, despite showing strong antiviral effects in preclinical models of infection with the coronaviruses. Also, in the Lancet study, no difference in mortality. Now, there was some talk about faster improvement in the subgroup who received remdesivir earlier, but this did not reach statistical significance, and even if it had, it was a subgroup of a trial with null results of the primary endpoint. Okay, so that's the Lancet study. Then comes the ACTT-1 trial published on Friday evening before a holiday weekend last week. The trial had about 1,000 patients equally distributed in the remdesivir versus placebo group. The primary endpoint was time to recovery, based on an 8-category ordinal scale ranging from 1, not in the hospital, no limitations at home, 2, not in the hospital, but some limitations at home, 3, hospitalized but not on oxygen, all the way up to 8, which was mortality or death. Patients in the remdesivir group had a shorter time to recovery than patients in the placebo group. The median 11 days as compared to 15 days, and this finding was highly significant with a very low p-value. The tougher signal to understand was mortality. This was mortality at 14 days. In the remdesivir arm, it was 7.1%, in placebo 11.9%, and that hazard ratio was 0.70. That's the point estimate. But the hazard ratio ranged from 0.47, which is amazing, versus 1.04, no effect. Now, right after that in the paper, an important sentence, one not emphasized in the mostly celebratory coverage of in mainstream media. And this sentence says, the Kaplan-Meier estimates of mortality by 28 days are not reported in this preliminary analysis given the large number of patients that had not yet to complete the day 29 visits. So the biggest talking point on this trial was the decision faced by the Independent Data Safety Monitoring Board, who on April 27th reviewed interim results. This review included a total of 482 patients with recoveries, and that exceeded the estimated number of recoveries needed for the trial. It also included 81 deaths. Here was the dilemma. They had a clear signal of benefit in time to improvement, but the absolute risk reduction of 3.8% of mortality, though it was quite large, did not meet statistical significance. The p-value there was 0.06. The confidence intervals spanned between a more than 50% reduction in death rate with the drug to no difference. That's tough. If the mortality signal is real, it is clearly worth giving this drug. But due to the small numbers of deaths, you can't be sure that it wasn't due to chance. The DSMB decided at this point in time to unblind the trial and let patients in the placebo group take remdesivir. And now, going forward in this adaptive RCT design, the new control group will include remdesivir. This likely means we'll never know for certain whether this drug actually reduces death. Not only do we have the uncertainty on the mortality effect in this trial, remember, we have the Lancet trial with not that much difference in patient characteristics, showing that remdesivir had no effect on mortality and no effect on time to recovery. So the part of my brain that thinks about being a patient would say, okay, I'm going to take the remdesivir in the event of a serious COVID infection, but my scientific brain wished they had let the trial run longer in blinded fashion so that we would have a true answer. Here's how I see it. Think about it this way. Months and years from now, with tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of people who have coronavirus infection, it would really have been nice to know whether this drug works with better certainty. Finally, friends, a concluding note on content. I've been gradually moving back to cardiology topics, but this week's relapse back into COVID science occurred because of my interest in evidence-based medicine, which has at its core the ability to sift through medical science. I consider the Lancet observational study and remdesivir RCT analyses good practice for evaluating cardiology studies. Remember, we still have the ischemia trial publication discussion coming soon and other cardiology topics. So that's it for this week in cardiology. And as always, I am grateful that you listened. Thank you. And remember, if you like this podcast, it really helps to give us a rating or write us a review so that others can find us. Until next week, this is John Mandrola from the heart.org, Medscape Cardiology.
You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from the heart.org on Medscape.